In today's hyper-competitive gaming landscape, technical excellence and innovative design are no longer enough to guarantee a game's success. We've entered an era where perception often trumps quality, where a game's cultural cachet, that elusive cool factor, can make or break its commercial viability. This phenomenon goes far beyond the traditional metrics like review scores or marketing budgets. It taps into deep psychological and sociological factors that dictate what captures the gaming community's collective imagination. Some of the most mechanically polished, narratively rich games fail to find an audience simply because they never achieve that crucial cultural momentum, while objectively flawed titles dominate the conversation through sheer social currency. Today we'll examine 20 key reasons why certain games, despite their many qualities, flounder commercially due to image problems, while others rise to the top on waves of hype and cultural relevance. A game's fate is frequently sealed long before its actual release, determined by the intangible but immensely powerful force of hype. Titles like Cyberpunk 2077 or No Man's Sky managed to survive disastrous launches and months of negative press precisely because their pre-release cultural momentum had transformed them into event games, titles where simply participating in the conversation, whether praising or criticizing, became a shared social experience. Conversely, games with similar or even fewer technical issues but lacking that hype foundation, think Anthem or Babylon's Fall, died instantly because they never achieved must-play status. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where the gaming community and content algorithms collectively decide which titles are worthy of attention, creating massive disparities in visibility and cultural staying power, regardless of actual quality. Visual presentation plays an outsized role in determining a game's cool factor, often overshadowing its actual gameplay merits. Highly stylized games with distinctive art directions, think Persona 5's bold red and black UI or Cuphead's vintage cartoon aesthetic, frequently develop cult followings that sustain them for years. Meanwhile, games with technically impressive but more generic, realistic graphics often struggle to make a lasting impression. Consider the case of Hi-Fi Rush. Its innovative rhythm-based combat system was universally praised, but its initial audience was limited by a cartoonish aesthetic that turned off mainstream players until sustained word-of-mouth overcame first impressions. On the flip side, the Callisto Protocol boasted AAA production values and stunning visuals, but flopped commercially because its derivative horror aesthetic felt dated compared to the Dead Space remake. This demonstrates that coolness isn't about raw graphical power, but about creating a visual identity distinctive enough to cut through the noise. The gaming landscape has increasingly become hostile to single-player narrative experiences, unless they're part of established franchises like God of War or The Last of Us. This shift stems from multiplayer games' inherent advantages in social media and streaming ecosystems. They're simply more visible and thus perceived as cooler. A masterpiece like Titanfall 2, widely praised for its brilliant campaign, couldn't compete with Call of Duty's multiplayer dominance because it lacked that social component. Even exceptional single-player experiences like Prey 2017 or Guardians of the Galaxy underperform because today's players increasingly prioritize games they can experience and discuss with friends. The social validation that comes from shared multiplayer experiences creates a gravitational pull that even the best single-player games struggle to overcome. Controversy can paradoxically enhance a game's cool factor, as demonstrated by franchises like Grand Theft Auto or the launch of Cyberpunk 2077. Glitches become memes, censorship debates drive engagement, and moral panics from outside the gaming community ironically boost appeal by framing the game as transgressive. Meanwhile, polished but uncontroversial games like Stray or Kena Bridge of Spirits might earn universal critical praise, only to be quickly forgotten because they never sparked heated discourse. The uncomfortable truth is that being talked about, even negatively, often matters more than being objectively good in today's attention economy. A game that divides opinion frequently enjoys longer cultural relevance than one that's universally admired but never debated. A game's viability as streaming content now significantly determines its commercial success, creating what we might call the streamer tax. Breakout hits, like Among Us and Fall Guys, achieved cultural dominance, not necessarily because they were the best games to play, but because they were incredibly fun to watch. Their mechanics and social dynamics made for perfect streaming content. Conversely, deep strategy games like Humankind or slow-paced narrative experiences like Pentiment struggle to gain traction because they don't translate well to the streaming format. This presents developers with an impossible dilemma. Do they design games for players or for the algorithms and content creators that now serve as the industry's primary gatekeepers? The most successful titles increasingly need to satisfy both masters simultaneously. Remakes, reboots, and legacy sequels enjoy built-in coolness by tapping into generational nostalgia, giving them a significant advantage over new IPs. The Resident Evil 4 remake or Final Fantasy VII Rebirth could rely on decades of built-up goodwill, while even excellent new properties like Atomic Heart or Forspoken face an uphill battle establishing cultural relevance. This explains why publishers increasingly rely on established franchises. Familiarity provides a safer path to that all-important cool factor than originality. The nostalgia effect creates a vicious cycle where new IPs struggle to gain traction, leading publishers to greenlight even more remakes and sequels, further crowding out original concepts. Some games successfully position themselves as cool by cultivating an against-the-grain image. Think Elden Ring's punishing difficulty or Hades' indie darling status. However, this rebel persona is often carefully manufactured rather than organic. True underdogs without marketing muscle or influencer support, games like Vampire: The Masquerade, Swansong, typically disappear without trace. This reveals that indie cred alone isn't enough. A game needs the right channels to amplify its alternative image. The paradox is that most successful underdog games are actually backed by sophisticated marketing strategies that carefully cultivate their outsider image while ensuring mainstream visibility. A game's pricing strategy significantly impacts its ability to achieve cool status. Free-to-play titles like Fortnite or cheap indie darlings like Vampire Survivors spread rapidly because they're low risk to try, allowing word of mouth to build organically. Conversely, premium-priced AA games like Wild Hearts often struggle because players wait for deep discounts, killing any chance of building cultural momentum at launch. Coolness requires accessibility, not just in terms of gameplay difficulty, but in financial barriers to entry. The most culturally dominant games are typically those with the fewest obstacles between curious players and the experience itself. Games with thriving competitive scenes maintain cultural relevance through an unexpected driver toxicity. Titles like League of Legends or Valorant stay perpetually in the conversation, not just through gameplay updates, but through the drama generated by their communities. Rage compilations, pro-player scandals, and toxic fan wars all serve to keep these games in the public eye. Meanwhile, more polite, well-balanced multiplayer games like Knockout City fade quickly because they don't generate the conflict-driven engagement that algorithms reward. The unfortunate reality is that harmonious communities often translate to cultural irrelevance in today's engagement-driven ecosystem. Games that spawn organic memes achieve a form of cultural immortality that transcends their actual quality. Skyrim's Arrow to the Knee or Metal Gear Rising's nanomachines became internet shorthand that kept these games relevant years after release. Meanwhile, technically superior games without strong meme potential, like A Plague Tale Requiem, lack this viral lifeline. Meme-worthiness has become an unspoken requirement for long-term cultural staying power, as shared in jokes create communities that outlast the games themselves. The platform a game appears on significantly impacts its cool factor due to entrenched brand perceptions. Xbox's relative lack of must-have exclusives in recent years has hurt its overall brand coolness, while PlayStation exclusives like Spider-Man 2 benefit from the platform's prestige aura. Multi-platform games often fall between the cracks, lacking the platform-specific hype that drives conversation. This platform bias creates uneven playing fields where a game's coolness is partially determined before it even launches based on its distribution strategy. Modern gaming culture has developed a pernicious phenomenon where once a game's player count dips below a certain threshold, it's labeled dead, a designation that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Battlefield 2042 managed to recover through persistent updates and communication, but titles like Crossfire X couldn't shake the stigma once it took hold. This demonstrates how perception becomes reality in gaming ecosystems. The belief that a game is dead leads players to abandon it, which in turn makes the belief true. The dead game label is particularly damaging because it's often applied based on social media sentiment rather than actual player numbers. The attention of major streamers and content creators can make or break a game's cool factor overnight. A single viral clip of someone like Dr. Disrespect playing Dead Drop can instantly transform a game's fortunes, while titles that fail to capture influencer attention, no matter their quality, like Midnight Suns, languish in obscurity. This influencer lottery creates unpredictable market conditions where a game's success may hinge on whether it randomly catches the eye of a handful of key content creators during its crucial launch window. Games perceived as overly demanding or complex face significant coolness barriers. While titles like Escape from Tarkov or Dwarf Fortress develop dedicated fan bases, their reputations for punishing difficulty scare off more casual players. Some games attempt to solve this through accessibility options, like Sifu's Easy Mode, but risk backlash from core fans accusing them of casualization. This creates a no-win situation where games are either too hard to be cool or too accessible to maintain hardcore credibility. Certain genres fight uphill battles against ingrained uncool stereotypes that have nothing to do with their actual quality. JRPGs and racing sims, for instance, often struggle to achieve mainstream coolness regardless of their merits. A masterpiece like Xenoblade Chronicles 3 will never trend like the latest Call of Duty because of these genre-based perceptions. This cultural baggage is exceptionally difficult to overcome as it's rooted in decades of gaming stereotypes and subcultural divisions. Live service games face particular challenges in the coolness department, often getting dismissed as corporate or soulless even when they're of high quality. Overwatch 2 and Diablo Immortal faced this perception hurdle despite their polished gameplay. Meanwhile, janky but passionate indie projects like Lethal Company get celebrated for their heart despite technical shortcomings. This double standard reveals how perception of a game's authenticity often outweighs its actual quality in determining cool factor. A handful of games demonstrate that coolness can be earned retroactively through persistent support and communication. No Man's Sky and Final Fantasy XIV famously transformed their reputations through years of updates and engagement with their communities. However, most games never get this second chance. The window for achieving cultural relevance is typically narrow, and once it closes, recovery becomes exponentially more difficult. Timing plays an underappreciated role in determining a game's coolness. Among Us became a global phenomenon in large part because it arrived during COVID lockdowns, when people were desperate for social connection. Conversely, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League launched into an overcrowded 2024 market, where even quality games struggled for attention. This element of luck, being the right game at the right time, is impossible to predict, but often decisive in determining which games achieve cultural liftoff. The uncomfortable truth is that coolness in gaming isn't distributed fairly or based purely on quality. It's the product of hype cycles, aesthetic choices, social dynamics, platform politics, and sheer luck. Developers today face the daunting challenge of creating not just great games, but culturally contagious ones that can survive in an increasingly winner-takes-all attention economy. For players, recognizing these biases can help us seek out and support overlooked gems before they're buried by algorithmic indifference. Ultimately, the best game isn't always the coolest one, but in today's ecosystem, the coolest game almost always wins. The challenge for the industry going forward is finding ways to reconcile artistic merit with cultural relevance in an increasingly unpredictable marketplace.